finance is the money investors put into your business for a share in the ownership of the company. As it's based on shares in the company, this type of finance is not available to sole traders or partnerships. This type of funding isn't based on a company's assets. This means that the investor faces the same risks as the business owner and other shareholders. If the business fails, they lose their money. Investors receive a return on their investment, either through the payment of dividends by the company or by the value they get for their shares when they sell them. Investors want to know two things. First, how big is the return they'll get on their investment? And secondly, what their exit plan is. That means how quickly they can leave the deal and move on to the next one. There are a number of advantages to equity finance. First, you can use the money you have from investors to fund your business, instead of having to make loan repayments to a bank or other organisation. You don't have the burden of debt to worry about. If you've prepared a prospectus for your investors and explained the risks in your business, investors will understand that if the business fails, they lose their money. Also, depending on who your investors are, they may offer valuable business assistance or bring skills and experience that you don't have. This can be important and valuable, particularly in the early stages of development of your business. Of course, there are also disadvantages to equity finance. The first is that the investors own a piece of your business. How much depends on how much money they invest. This means that you no longer wholly control the business, and investors may want to have their say and make decisions. To help mitigate this, it's advisable to create two classes of shares, one for founders and directors and a second for investors. The shares owned by the founders and directors enable them to decide business strategy and give them a right to vote. The shares owned by investors do not give them any rights to have a say in the business direction. A good shareholder agreement is essential to manage this effectively. Another disadvantage is that investors expect a share of the profits, whereas if you have debt financing, the lender only requires that the loan is repaid. This can be an advantage in the first few years. If you don't make a profit, the investor doesn't expect to be paid. However, after all your hard work, when you do make a profit, you may not want to give a share of it to your investors. Also, since your investors own a piece of your business, you are expected to act in their best interest as well as your own. If they have very different views about the business, this may prove difficult. It's important to weigh up the advantages and disadvantages of equity funding for your business. Whilst it can be a demanding, expensive and time-consuming process to secure investors, there are big benefits to be had as well. And remember, whilst the most common type of equity finance is through business angels or venture capitalists, you can offer ownership opportunities to family and friends in return for their investment. That may be something to consider for your business.